Do you know that your life is about to experience something that you can't even imagine? You've been waiting, hoping, praying for a breakthrough. But what if I told you that what God has in store for you is beyond anything you've ever dreamed of? We often limit ourselves by what we see in the natural, what we feel in the moment, or what our circumstances are telling us. But God, He is not bound by time or human limitations. He doesn't operate by the same rules we live by. When He decides to move in your life, He doesn't just meet your expectations, He exceeds them. He doesn't just open doors, He creates new pathways that you didn't even know existed. Have you ever wondered why certain things haven't worked out the way you planned? Perhaps it's because what you were expecting is too small for the greatness He has destined for you. Your vision, your plans, your dreams, they're all just stepping stones to the greater purpose He has placed within you. What you think is enough is only the beginning. The way He operates isn't just about fulfilling what you want. It's about fulfilling what He has purposed you for. You are about to experience a season where your prayers are not just answered, they are over-delivered. You know, often in life, we tend to limit ourselves by our own expectation. We set goals based on what we think is possible, what we can comprehend with our human understanding. But the truth is, God's plans for us are far beyond what we can imagine. He's not confined to the boundaries of our limitations. When He moves in our lives, He doesn't simply meet our expectations, He exceeds them in ways we can't even fathom. Think about this. In the Bible, we see story after story of God doing things that defy human logic. Look at Abraham, for example. He was a man promised by God to be the father of many nations. Yet for years, he and his wife Sarah were childless. To the natural eye, it seemed impossible. At a certain point, Abraham even tried to help God out by taking matters into his own hands. But God, in His perfect timing, exceeded Abraham's expectation. He didn't just give him a child, He gave him the promised son, Isaac. And through Isaac, an entire lineage of people who would become the nation of Israel. What seemed impossible to Abraham became a reality, not because Abraham had the capacity to believe it, but because God's plan was far beyond Abraham's limited understanding. This principle applies to each one of us. Maybe you've been waiting for a breakthrough, a miracle, or solution to a problem, but all you see is the current state of things, the limitations, the struggles, the challenges that seem to stand in your way. Perhaps you've been praying for something for years and it feels like you're stuck in a season of waiting. But don't let that deceive you. What God has in store for you is not limited to your present circumstances. He sees the bigger picture, the one you cannot yet see. And He is orchestrating things in ways you can't yet understand. Let me ask you, have you ever been in a situation where you thought there was no way out, only for God to show up and do something beyond what you expected? Maybe you were in a financial crisis and you thought there was no way to make ends meet. You were just about to give up, but then out of nowhere, a new opportunity opened up, or someone stepped into your life to help you. You didn't see it coming, and yet God exceeded your expectations. He didn't just meet your need, He went above and beyond what you had imagined. That's the nature of our God. He does not operate in the realm of just enough. He operates in the realm of abundance. Think about Jesus feeding the realm of abundance. Think about Jesus feeding the realm of bread and 2 fish. In that moment, the disciples could only see the small offering and they saw the vast crowd before them. They didn't understand how Jesus could possibly feed so many people with so little. But Jesus didn't just feed them, He provided more than enough with 12 baskets of leftovers. It wasn't just a miracle to meet the need. It was a statement that God's provision is never limited to our expectations. He is the God who takes what little we have and turns it into more than enough. This idea of God exceeding our expectations is not limited to the Bible. In real life, we see it all around us. Maybe you've been stuck in a job that doesn't seem to be going anywhere, and you've been praying for a change. One day, out of nowhere, an unexpected opportunity comes your way. A promotion, a new career path, or a connection that opens doors you never thought possible. This is God exceeding your expectations, working behind the scenes in ways you couldn't have planned for yourself. But here's the thing. Often, the reason we don't experience the fullness of God's blessings is because we've become too comfortable with what we know, with what we can control. We set small goals and small expectations because we're afraid of dreaming too big. We focus on what seems possible from our human perspective. But God is not limited by what we can see. He wants us to think beyond the small human limitations we place on ourselves and embrace the fullness of His plans for us. When we choose to trust in Him, to have faith in the unseen, we open ourselves up to the unimaginable. Do you believe that God has something greater for you than what you see today? Are you willing to let go of your small expectations and trust that He can exceed them in ways you've never dreamed of? Your breakthrough, your miracle, your success, it's not going to come in the way you expect, but it will come in a way that will leave you in awe of what God can do. God's plans for you are bigger than you can conceive. He's about to do something in your life that will blow your mind. Keep believing, keep expecting, and trust that He is working in ways you cannot see. Don't limit God to your small vision. His plan is greater, and He will exceed your expectations. When we talk about the impossible, we often think about the situations in our lives that seem insurmountable. It's easy to fall into the trap of believing that what we're facing is beyond any possible solution. We see our problems, our struggles, our limitations, and it feels like we're staring at an insurmountable mountain. But here's the truth. What you see as impossible is not impossible for God. In fact, the very idea of impossibility doesn't exist in His realm. Look at the story of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Here was a young woman living in a small town, betrothed to be married, and suddenly an angel appears to her and tells her that she is going to conceive a child, not by man, but by the Holy Spirit. Now think about it. This was absolutely impossible in every natural sense. How could she, a virgin, become pregnant? From a human perspective, there was no logical explanation. Yet Mary responded with faith, saying, "Let it be to me according to your word." And what seemed impossible became a reality. The angel's response to Mary was key, for with God nothing will be impossible. Luke 1:37. This verse doesn't just apply to Mary, it applies to all of us. What we see as impossible is only impossible through human eyes. But with God, the boundaries of possibility are stretched beyond our comprehension. The limits we place on ourselves and on God are not the same limits He operates under. His power is not confined by human understanding. There are countless stories throughout the Bible where God takes what seems impossible and makes it happen. Think about Moses, standing before the Red Sea, with Pharaoh's army chasing him. The sea was in front, the army was behind, and there was no way out. To the natural eye, it was a situation of certain defeat. But God didn't see it that way. He parted the sea, and Moses and the Israelites walked through on dry ground. To us, parting an entire sea is impossible, but with God, it wasn't just possible, it was the plan. God often works in ways that go against the grain of human understanding to reveal His glory and power. In our own lives, we often encounter moments where it seems like there is no way forward. Perhaps you're in a financial struggle and the bills are piling up, or maybe you've been dealing with a health crisis that no doctor has been able to solve. It feels like everything is against you, but I want to remind you, what seems impossible to you is not impossible for God. He is able to make a way where there is no way. He can open doors that no one else can open. He can provide where there seems to be no provision. The question isn't whether God can do it. The question is whether you believe that he will. Think about the story of the woman with the issue of blood. For 12 years, she had suffered, seeking help from doctors, but no one could heal her. In a hopeless situation, she believed that if she could just touch the hem of Jesus' garment, she would be healed. Her faith was so strong that she didn't see the impossibility of her situation. She saw the possibility of God's power to heal. And she received her healing. What looked impossible in the natural after 12 years of suffering was made possible by faith in the power of God. When we face challenges, we tend to look at them through the lens of what we think is possible based on our experiences and the limitations we've known. But God wants us to take the limits off and believe that he can do more than we can ask or imagine. What is it that you've been telling yourself is impossible? What situation in your life seems like it can never change? You may see an obstacle that can't be overcome, but God sees an opportunity to demonstrate his power in your life. What if you stopped looking at your circumstances and started looking at the God who holds the universe in his hands? But if you started seeing the possibilities instead of the limitations? God's power is not limited by what you see. It's limited only by your faith. Jesus said to the disciples, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can move mountains. That's how limitless God's power is. Your faith, no matter how small, can unlock the supernatural. So today I challenge you. Stop defining your future by what seems impossible. Stop limiting God by your own human understanding. The challenges you face may seem overwhelming, but they are no match for the God who parted the Red Sea, healed the sick, and raised the dead. He is the same God, and he is more than able to do the impossible in your life. You may not see the way right now, but trust that God is working behind the scenes. What seems impossible to you is an opportunity for God to show up in a mighty way. Keep your eyes on him, keep your faith strong, and watch what he will do. He is able to turn your impossibility into a testimony of his greatness. We live in a world where we are constantly reminded of our limitations. We are told what we can and can't do based on our circumstances, our resources, and even our own abilities. But when we begin to understand who God is and the power he has placed within us, we realize that our limitations are not his limitations. What we perceive as a barrier or obstacle is not something that can stop God's plans. He works beyond the limits we place on ourselves. In fact, God often uses our weaknesses to display his strength, and he is never restricted by the boundaries that we set. Think about the story of Gideon. When God called him to lead Israel to victory over the Midianites, Gideon didn't see himself as capable. In his own eyes, he was the least of his family. From the weakest clan in Israel, he felt insignificant, inadequate, and unqualified. But God didn't see him the way he saw himself. He saw a man who was ready to fulfill a purpose, and he called Gideon to rise up and lead. God instructed him to assemble an army, but then, in a move that must have seemed illogical, he told Gideon to reduce the size of the army. From 32,000 men, the army was reduced to only 300. And with those 300 men, they defeated an army that was far greater in number. What God was showing Gideon and what he shows us is that his power is not dependent on our strength or ability. His plans are not limited by what we have or don't have. God often works in the opposite way of what we expect. He doesn't need our strength to do the impossible. In fact, our weaknesses can often become the stage upon which God demonstrates his mighty power. God told Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." 1 Corinthians 12:9. Our limitations are opportunities for God to reveal his limitless power. This principle is critical in how we view our own lives. How often do we focus on our weaknesses and limitations instead of focusing on the boundless strength of the one who calls us? We might look at our lack of resources, our past mistakes, or our current struggles, and decide that we are not capable of achieving anything great. But God doesn't work based on what we have or don't have. He works based on his ability to provide and equip us for the purpose he has called us to. Take, for example, the story of David and Goliath. Here was a young shepherd boy standing before a giant warrior armed with nothing but a slingshot and a few stones. The odds were impossible. In the natural, David was no match for Goliath. But David didn't see the giant as an obstacle. He saw it as an opportunity for God to demonstrate his power. You come against me with a sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, David declared, 1 Samuel 17:45. And with one small stone, David defeated the giant, showing that what may seem impossible to us is nothing for God. God works in ways that transcend human limitation. He isn't restricted by the things we think are holding us back. If we look at the Bible, we can see that many of God's greatest victories were accomplished through people who, on their own, would have never been able to achieve such feats. Moses, a man who had once fled Egypt in fear, became the leader who freed an entire nation. Esther, an orphan girl, became queen and saved her people from annihilation. The disciples, ordinary fishermen, went on to turn the world upside down with the gospel. So when we look at our own lives, it's important to remember that our limitations are not barriers to what God can do. The things we perceive as weaknesses are actually opportunities for God to show himself strong. The things we think disqualify us are the very things that God can use to fulfill his purpose in our lives. God is not concerned with what we think we lack. He is concerned with what he can do through us if we are willing to trust him and surrender to his will. Consider the example of a seed. A tiny seed buried in the ground may seem insignificant and weak, but when the conditions are right, that seed grows into something far greater than its small beginnings. In the same way, our limitations may seem like they're holding us back, but God can take those limitations and use them to grow something greater than we could ever imagine. The seed doesn't need to worry about the soil, the sunlight, or the water. It just needs to be planted. And in due time, it will bear fruit. What would happen if we stopped focusing on our limitations and started trusting God with our weaknesses? What if we stopped saying, I can't, and started saying, with God, I can? We don't have to be the strongest, the smartest, or the most capable. We simply need to be willing to let God work in and through us. He will supply the strength, the wisdom, and the resources we need to accomplish his will. The only limit to what God can do through us is our willingness to surrender our limitations to him. So whatever you're facing today, don't allow your perceived limitations to stop you. God is not bound by what you think is possible. Trust him to work through your weaknesses and watch as he moves beyond your wildest expectations. With God, there are no limits. Faith is not just a concept we talk about. It's the very foundation that unlocks God's ability to work in our lives. When we believe in God's power and trust in his promises, we open the door for him to move in ways we could never imagine. However, it's not just about having faith. It's about the type of faith we have. Faith is not just a passive belief, but an active driving force that moves us to take action, to step forward even when we can't see the entire path. Faith in God isn't limited by what we can understand. It's about trusting that he knows what's best and that his timing is perfect. Think about the story of Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. But for years, nothing seemed to happen. Abraham was in his old age, and his wife Sarah was well beyond the age of childbearing. From a human perspective, the promise seemed impossible. But Abraham believed in God's promise, even when it made no sense. Hebrews 11:8 says that by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place which he would receive as an inheritance. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but his faith moved him to take action. God counted that faith as righteousness, and through Abraham, God brought about the fulfillment of his promise. This kind of faith is not about knowing all the details ahead of time. It's about trusting that when God says he will do something, he will do it no matter how impossible it seems. The key here is obedience. Faith without action is dead. Abraham's faith was demonstrated through his obedience, and that's the kind of faith we are called to have. Faith that moves us to trust God's plan, even when we don't understand the how or the when. Real life situations often mirror this principle. Consider the example of someone who is struggling financially and prays for a breakthrough. It's easy to just sit back and wait for something to happen, but the type of faith that moves mountains requires us to act in faith. Perhaps God is calling that person to step out of their comfort zone, to take a job they wouldn't normally consider, or to trust him with their finances in a way they haven't before. It's not always easy to take that step, but God honors faith that leads to action. One of the most powerful stories of faith in action is the story of Peter walking on water. The disciples were caught in a storm, and when they saw Jesus walking on the water, they were terrified. But Jesus called out to Peter, telling him to come to him. Peter didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the boat, trusting that if Jesus said it, it was possible. And for a brief moment, he walked on water. As long as his eyes were on Jesus, he was able to do the impossible. But when he took his focus off Jesus and began to look at the storm, he started sinking. This moment teaches us a valuable lesson. When we focus on God's promises and trust him, we are able to do what seems impossible. But when we take our eyes off him and focus on our circumstances, we begin to doubt, and the impossible becomes the overwhelming. Faith moves us to action, but it also moves us to believe in things that seem beyond our grasp. Think about the woman with the issue of blood in the Bible. She had spent years trying to find a cure for her condition, but nothing worked. She was desperate, yet she heard that Jesus was passing by, and she believed in the power of Jesus to heal her. In Mark 5:28, she says to herself, "If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well." That belief, her faith, was so strong that it drove her to take action. She pressed through the crowd, risking ridicule and rejection, and touched the hem of Jesus' garment. And in that moment, Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." She was healed not just because she touched him, but because her faith moved her to act on the belief that Jesus could do the impossible. How often do we hold back from stepping out in faith because we're waiting for the perfect circumstances or the perfect timing? We wait until everything aligns before we take action. But God calls us to take steps of faith even when the way isn't clear. God is waiting for us to trust him with what we have and step out, just like the woman with the issue of blood did. What's interesting is that faith doesn't require perfect conditions, perfect understanding, or even perfect confidence. It only requires trust. Think about the mustard seed Jesus mentioned in Matthew 17:20. He said, "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can move mountains." A mustard seed is tiny, barely visible to the naked eye. But with that small amount of faith, God can do the impossible. It's not about the size of our faith, but about the size of the God we place our faith in. Are you willing to take that first step in faith, even if the path ahead is unclear? Are you willing to trust that God will provide, even when you don't see how it's possible? The truth is, faith is the key that unlocks the door to the impossible. When we trust God and move in faith, he moves mountains on our behalf. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it. When you take that step of faith, expect to see God move in ways you never thought possible. You've been waiting for something, for a breakthrough, a change, a promise to be fulfilled. It may feel like you've been in the waiting room for longer than you ever imagined. And with each passing day, the hope that things will turn around starts to wear thin. The hope that footprints start to wear thin. But here's the thing. What you've been waiting for is not the end. It's only the beginning. God's timing is perfect, and often what seems like a long wait is actually God preparing something greater than you could have ever imagined. Take a moment and think about the story of Joseph. Joseph had a dream that one day his family would bow down to him. He saw himself in a position of leadership, yet his reality was far from that dream. Instead of moving forward toward his destiny, he was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. Year after year, Joseph's situation seemed to get worse, not better. But in the midst of all the trials, Joseph didn't lose hope. He didn't stop believing in the dream God had given him. And eventually, when the time was right, God elevated him to the very position he had seen in his dream. Second in command of all of Egypt. The wait wasn't the end. It was the preparation for something greater. What seemed like a delay was actually God's perfect timing at work. This is the kind of perspective we need to have in our own lives. So often, we look at the length of our waiting seasons and begin to doubt that God will come through. We wonder why it's taking so long, and we may even begin to question whether what we're waiting for is ever going to happen. But remember, God doesn't work on our timetable. His understanding of timing is far superior to ours. He sees the bigger picture. He knows what needs to happen in our hearts, in our lives, and in the lives of others before he brings the promise to fruition. In the book of Ecclesiastes, it says, "To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven." Ecclesiastes 3:1. What if this season of waiting is actually the time of preparation for you to step into something greater? Think about a seed that has been planted in the ground. The seed doesn't sprout overnight. It has to go through a process of growth and development. The roots have to be established before it can break through the surface and bear fruit. Likewise, God is preparing you in ways that may not always be visible on the surface, but in his perfect timing. Another example we can look at is the Israelites' journey through the wilderness. After being freed from slavery in Egypt, they were given the promise of a land flowing with milk and honey. But instead of entering immediately, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. It wasn't because God had forgotten his promise, but because there was a preparation process they had to go through. The Israelites needed to learn to trust God, to rely on him, and to grow in faith before they could step into the promised land. The wilderness wasn't the end. It was a necessary journey that led them to the beginning of God's promise. So when you feel like you've been waiting too long, don't see it as a sign of failure or abandonment. See it as an opportunity for growth and preparation. You may not understand why things aren't happening as quickly as you'd like, but trust that God is working in ways you cannot yet see. Just because you haven't received what you've been hoping for doesn't mean that it's not coming. It means that God is still working on the details. He's still working on you, refining you, and positioning you for the next phase of your life. Think about your own life for a moment. Have there been times when it seemed like you were waiting forever for something to change? And then, just when you thought all hope was lost, God showed up in a way that was beyond your expectations. Maybe you've been waiting for a promotion at work and you felt overlooked for years. Perhaps you've been waiting for a breakthrough in your finances or your health. You may not see it yet, but trust that God is working behind the scenes, preparing the perfect timing for your breakthrough. One of the most challenging parts of waiting is that we often can't see what God is doing during the process. But if we choose to trust in his timing, we will see that he has been working in ways we never expected. He is orchestrating things in the background that will make the wait worthwhile. Think of it like a potter working with clay. The potter doesn't rush the process. Every twist, every turn, every molding of the clay is done with purpose. Here, the final product may take time to form, but the end result is a beautiful work of art that could never have been achieved without patience and careful hands. It's easy to grow weary in the waiting, but God's word encourages us to keep pressing forward. In Galatians 6:9, it says, "Let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. The key to enduring the waiting season is to keep doing good, keep trusting, and keep believing that in due time the promise will come to pass. Whatever it is you've been waiting for, remember that God has not forgotten you. The delay is not the denial. What you've been waiting for is only the beginning of something greater. Keep trusting in His perfect timing and know that when the time is right, He will exceed your expectations. It's essential to understand that God's plans for us are not limited by our understanding or imagination. His vision for our lives goes far beyond the dreams we've set for ourselves, and He is able to do more than we could ever ask or think. But we often limit God by the narrow scope of our expectations. We might settle for a vision that is far too small, believing that our dreams are the highest we can reach, when in reality, God has something far greater in store for us. Consider the story of Solomon, who inherited the throne from his father David. When Solomon became king, he prayed for wisdom, understanding, and the ability to govern God's people well. God was pleased with Solomon's request, and He granted him wisdom beyond measure. But that was not all. God also gave Solomon wealth, honor, and a long life, things Solomon had not even asked for. God exceeded his expectations in ways Solomon could never have imagined. Solomon had asked for wisdom, but God gave him much more, showing that God's blessings always surpass the limits of our requests. Solomon's life is a powerful example of how God doesn't just meet our expectations, He far exceeds them. But there's more to this than simply receiving unexpected blessings. When God exceeds our expectations, it's not just for our benefit, it's a testimony to His glory, a reflection of His goodness and faithfulness. God doesn't bless us just to make our lives easier. He blesses us to make His name known. Think about the story of Job. Job went through unimaginable suffering, losing everything he had, including his health and his family. But at the end of his trials, God restored everything to Job, not just in the same measure, but twofold. God not only restored Job's wealth, but He also blessed him with more children and greater honor. Job's story is a testament to how, after trials and testing, God's plan for us is always greater than we could imagine. It's important to understand that God's ability to exceed our expectations isn't just about material blessings or outward success. Often, it's about transformation from the inside out. We might have one expectation for our lives, perhaps a career goal, a personal milestone, or a relationship. But God's plan often includes growth that surpasses what we could envision. In Ephesians 3:20, it says, "Now to Him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to His power that is at work within us." This verse reminds us that God's power working in us is the key to seeing His plans unfold in ways we can't anticipate. God doesn't just exceed our expectations in a material sense. He works in us and through us to transform us into the people He created us to be, people whose potential is far greater than we could ever understand. How often do we limit God by our own understanding? We may have an idea of what success looks like, what happiness should be, or what our lives should look like. But God's vision for us is always greater than what we can see with our limited human perspective. For instance, look at the Apostle Paul. Paul's life was radically transformed from a persecutor of Christians to one of the most influential leaders in the early church. He was not only an evangelist, but also a writer whose letters form a significant part of the New Testament. Paul's life is a reminder that God's plans for us are not confined to what we expect. He can take us from the most unexpected circumstances and elevate us to places of great influence for His kingdom. Now, think about your own life. What dreams or expectations have you set for yourself? What vision do you have for your future? Are those dreams aligned with God's plans for you? It's easy to dream small, to think in terms of what is immediately attainable based on our resources, abilities, or knowledge. But what if God is calling you to a bigger vision? What if He wants to exceed your expectations and take you further than you ever imagined? The key is to surrender our limited expectations and align ourselves with His greater plan. When we open our hearts to the idea that God can do immeasurably more than we ask or think, we position ourselves to experience His power in ways we never thought possible. Take the example of the Israelites when they were in the wilderness. They were in a season of waiting, but they had no idea that God was preparing a land for them that was far better than anything they had ever known. The land they were going to was described as flowing with milk and honey, a place of abundance and blessing. They couldn't see it at the time, but God was leading them towards something greater than they could have ever dreamed. What they had to do was trust in His promises, even when they couldn't fully comprehend what was ahead. Similarly, in our own lives, we must trust that God is leading us toward a future that is far greater than we can imagine. He may be preparing something in us or for us that will far exceed what we have expected. God's ability to exceed our expectations is not just limited to things we want in the material world. It also applies to the desires of our hearts that align with His will. We may want to see relationships restored, or perhaps we are praying for healing or a breakthrough in an area of life that feels impossible. While we wait, God may be working in ways that we cannot see, setting the stage for something greater than we could ever envision. In these moments, it's crucial that we trust His timing, His methods, and His purpose. He knows what we need, and He is able to provide in ways we cannot comprehend. So, when you find yourself in a season of waiting, or when your dreams feel too small, remember that God is able to do more than you can ask or imagine. His plan is bigger. His blessings are greater, and His purpose for your life is beyond your comprehension. Trust Him to exceed your expectations and watch as He moves you into a future that is filled with more than you ever thought possible. As we reflect on the journey we've just explored, remember that God is not only able to meet your expectations, but He is ready to exceed them. His plans for you are grander, His timing is perfect, and His love and purpose for your life know no limits. Trust in His promises. Believe in His ability to work in ways beyond your understanding, and be ready to step into a future that's far greater than anything you could have imagined. So as you go forward, hold on to your faith, keep expecting the unimaginable, and remember that God's best for you is yet to come. May you walk in His grace, knowing that the road ahead is filled with possibilities that are beyond your wildest dreams. Good luck, and thank you for allowing me to share this time with you. May God continue to bless you, exceed your expectations, and lead you into His greater purpose. Thank you, and may you have a life filled with hope, faith, and endless possibilities.